Hello, I'm David Dawdy, and I'm the chairman of the History of Hydrology Committee of the American Geophysical Union. And we are here in Boulder at the quadrennial assembly of the IUGG and the IAHS, the International Association of Hydrological Sciences. And we're taking this opportunity to participate in an oral history project with the AGU. Today, I'm on the hot seat, and I have here my good friend and longtime colleague and friend, Terence O'Donnell, Professor Emeritus from Lancaster University, and at present the editor of the Journal of Hydrological Sciences of the IEHS. And Terence, I turn it over to you to grill me.
Thank you, Dave. Perhaps I should preface my grilling by saying that I spent a year working with Dave when I was at that time working at Imperial College in London as a reader in hydrology. And I was invited by the authorities in the US Geological Survey to spend a sabbatical year at Menlo Park working with Dave. So I got to know him fairly well then, and our acquaintanceship has, I think, flourished over the years since.
Yes.
We've kept in fairly close touch in conferences and correspondence. And again, as part of my editorship of Hydrological Sciences Journal, I have frequently asked Dave to review papers in his many fields of expertise. I'd regard Dave as a hydrologist extraordinaire. Very multifaceted person and many, many interests over the whole field of hydrology, far broader than my own interests, but overlapping with them. If I weren't so grey myself, I would say he is the eminence grise of the organization. So let me ask you, Dave, how did you start? How did you get into hydrology? Because I know that you graduated in a non-technical subject.
Yes, it was purely an accident. I was hungry and looking for a job, and there was an opening in the Geological Survey for what they called a hydrologic field assistant, which was really a day laborer, because they had a big flood in California in December of 1950, and all of the staff were out rebuilding gauging stations that had been washed away. And so they hired people off the street. Luckily, I happened to be on the street at that time, and I was hired on what's called a 180-day appointment, which means it's a temporary appointment, and they can get rid of you when they want to. And that temporary appointment lasted for 25 years.
Mm-hmm. But in between whiles, you have spent time at places like Colorado State University, but still part of the USGS.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go back to the early days in the USGS. You got out of the stream gauging, that is the practical side of things, into doing things with the data that the stream gauges were collecting.
Yeah, the first couple of years I was strictly a stream gauger, working up the records and getting ready for publication. And then we had what was called a compilation report, a national compilation report, in which the Geological Survey took all the old records and brought them up to current standards, reviewed every record that had ever been measured and revised a lot of them, particularly the peak flows. And I got involved in that for the California data and had an enjoyable 2 years learning a lot about data and
quality control.
yes, quality control and stuff like that.
Yeah. And that work, has that sort of topic been developed yet further, or did you solve all the problems and go on to something else?
Oh, we solved almost all of them, but not quite. They still continue that today. Each 5 or 10 years, the Geological Survey brings everything up to date and reviews everything and puts it into a common framework. But out of that actually grew, as in your case, some interests which keep appearing throughout my career. One of those was because I was redoing all the ratings in California. I was sort of the straw boss for that operation with a group of young people under me. We reviewed all of the ratings that had ever been developed in California, and I found many of them on sand channel streams that started me off in a direction which later turned out to be a primary interest.
In the sediment transport problems, yes. The insoluble problems of sediment transport, in my view, but
yes.
Others think they have solved those problems.
They have gone pretty far along in at least understanding what some of the problems are. Solving them is something else again.
Indeed. But then I think you moved to Washington, was it, in 1956?
Yes, as a result of that job we were just talking about, I had this crew of people under me, so when the December of 1955 flood hit, which hit Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, suddenly there was a demand for a group to process all of what are called the indirect determinations. We had a program in those days when you had a major flood that people from all over the country would converge on the area and go out and do indirect determinations, flows over dams, flows through culverts, general slope areas. And I was in charge of the group, which was our compilation report group, that reviewed all these and worked them up and got them ready for, once again, quality control to get things consistent. And a guy by the name of Manuel Benson came out from Washington to be the guru for this group. And as a result of that, I then went into Washington with Manuel Benson because the Geological Survey had just set up a research program in the Water Resource Division. And Manuel Benson started off doing research in flood frequency analysis. And I went in as his first assistant and was there with Manuel, with Ben, when he was developing the present quantile method for flood frequency analysis.
I seem to remember seeing this either as a water supply paper or would it have been a professional paper?
No, they were water supply papers.
Water supply papers.
First one was the one for New England. That's the one that essentially we studied. In those days, we had hand calculators. We didn't even have electronic calculators. And we sat there.
With the old Brunsviga,
yes,
round and round and
going round and round.
And backwards sometimes when you overshot.
Doing, what did they call the backward solution? Oh, I forget what it was, but we solved it forward and then we solved it backwards. And if we got the same answer, then we had checked ourselves.
Yeah.
And we did that for hundreds and hundreds of correlations,
yeah.
Multiple correlations.
Would it be a good thing for modern young hydrologists to be given 3 months without a PC and only a hand calculator?
Pencil and piece of paper. Let's do it the hard way. But in particular, they should start off stream gauging. They'll find out what the data mean. And I think a lot of hydrologists these days, or as I keep telling in my inimitable manner, we have a group of PhD hydrologists who were trained by a group of PhD hydrologists who were trained by a group of PhD hydrologists, and it's been several generations since any of them knew what hydrology was. But yes, I think stream gauging is the best training, and working on data as I did, and perhaps not using a computer and having to think instead would be a good training ground for
I never met Manuel Benson, but I was aware of him because, of course, the work you were doing was being reported in not only water supply papers, but I think in papers in the journals.
Yes.
Was he a good man to work with?
He was an outstanding man to work with. Ben was a very biased person, biased in the best sense. He was convinced of certain things engineering-wise, because he was a good engineer. He was convinced there was no such thing as a flood frequency distribution, which is very interesting because he's the one that then was the head of the committee that picked the standard, quote, official log Pearson 3 flood frequency distribution, which he did under charge of the Congress of the United States. Ben also was convinced that the index flood method, which the USGS was using, developed in the 40s and was using throughout the country, was inadequate, and that there had to be a different method, and he developed the quantile method, which is why we ran so many multiple correlations, because we were testing out different variables, and we were doing it for all these different return periods, and so we ground away a lot. Another one of Ben's biases, if you will, is that you should not extrapolate data. And so therefore, when he drew up his flood frequency curves, and we plotted them all on a piece of paper, and Ben drew the line because he knew where those curves went. And then we picked off the various discharges only up to the length of the record, maybe a little beyond. So if you look in those early reports that Ben was the author of, you'll see that as you went up in return period, you went down in the number of stations that defined it, because Ben says that station is no good except a 25-year flood because it only has 25 years of data, and so forth. But I think Ben picked New England for the first study, first because he was from New England, he was from Boston, Boston Latin Grammar School and Harvard University, but also because the floods of hurricanes of 1938 and 55 had actually washed out some of the Pilgrim buildings, so that we knew that it was the biggest flood in 300 years and such. So he could define the 200 and 300-year flood based on those records. So he picked it for that reason, whereas out west, there was nobody out there 200 or 300 years ago. So his first study was in New England, and that was a really pioneering study, and came up with the quantile method that is still used throughout the U.S. by the Geological Survey.
Now, this is the middle to late 50s.
Yes.
Was
Actually,
Nick
56 to 58, because I left Benson in 58 because they wanted to move me out and get me involved in other things. I went from the flood work with Benson to work with Walter Langbein for a summer. And Walter he's the only genius in hydrology that I've known. He was a person of immense knowledge who knew everything, it seems. And he gave me about 6 problems that summer to work on, some of which I'm sure he knew the answer to, but he wanted me to find out for myself, so he pretended he knew nothing. And one of them that he asked me was, could I find out what a Markov process was? Well, I'd never heard of a Markov process. When I got through and tried to tell him, all I could say is, I have no idea what it is, because I've read all these books, and they don't make any sense. Well, it was really a very simple concept, but when you read a math book on Markov processes, it doesn't make any sense. But that was one of them. Another one was to do a regional precipitation map. Another one was information theory. Dave, could you find out what these people are talking about? They call this thing information theory. What does that mean? Well, Walter knew that backwards and forwards, but I was naive enough to think that he really wanted me to teach him about it. So anyway, it was a wonderful 6 weeks.
Well, you remind me.
You were going to ask about Nick. Yes, Nick came in during that period.
Nick Metalis.
Nick Metalis. Yes. And he was in the next office, I guess, doing independent work. He was sponsored by the Geological Survey at Harvard to get his PhD after graduating from North Carolina, University of North Carolina, where he had, maybe North Carolina State, I better not say. Anyway, from a university in North Carolina. And he did his dissertation in stochastic hydrology, some of the first stochastic hydrology with the Harvard group under Thomas, and then came to the survey and was doing independent work as a project chief, going off doing his own thing on stochastic hydrology. And in the next office, and we were very close friends.
Yes, because it was through you, when I spent my time with you, that I first met Nick. He came out to California, and a certain amount of brainstorming went on blackboards at that time, which I didn't understand. I just sat quietly in the corner trying to look as if I did understand. Yes, I remember that period very well. After that, you got on to your favorite sandbed game here, the resistance to flow in sandbed streams.
That came out of the stuff on quality control in California. When I was in California, I noticed that the streams in Southern California acted odd, but we didn't do anything about it. But I knew that there was great arguments over the size of the big floods in Southern California, and I read all that correspondence and everything. And so I developed sort of a technique for looking at these, which was to plot a hydraulic radius against the velocity. And you get a different thing if you plot stage against discharge. And the ratings were quite different then. And so after I finished that summer with Walter Langbein, I was sent back, and Roland Carter, my boss, head of research, and Langbein and Leopold, who was then chief hydrologist, Luna Leopold, were trying to make up their mind what I should do, because I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any idea. And they were going to find a project for me. So while I was waiting, I helped out some people in operations research who were studying frequency of sampling for accuracy of streamflow records. How often should you measure? And they were using the San Juan River at Shiprock, New Mexico, and when I took their data and plotted it up, it looked just like those Southern California streams. So I took it into Roland Carter and laid it on the table in front of him and said, Carter, you know, this stream acts just like the Mojave River in Southern California. You know, look, it's got this break in the rating, a discontinuity in the rating. He said, my God, that's what they've been getting in the flume at Fort Collins. And they've been calling it a flume artifact, that it was not a real thing because they hadn't defined it far enough up. They'd gotten, because of the size of the flume, they could only get up to where it became discontinuous, but they never got to the point where it went on up. And so he grabbed me and these pieces of paper, and we went over to Luna and laid it in front of Luna, and Luna said, when can you leave? And the next thing I knew, I was out in the west looking for other streams like that.
And where were you based at that time?
In Washington, D.C.
Yeah, but when you went out west?
Oh, I was based in a car.
See.
I just rented
a mobile office.
Yeah, it's a mobile office. In fact, Doris went with me. We went out, and I got a car out of the carpool in Denver and headed off to Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, New Mexico, Arizona, just a big loop. And I had identified the stations by looking at the ratings in the files in Washington and talking to people. So I was going around getting samples of the bed material. And then I took them to Fort Collins and left them to get sieved. We got the size analyses, and then based on the size analyses, we got a relationship which is still used in the GS for resistance to flow in sand channel streams. The resistance for upper regime flows, as they call it, to the bed material, the D50. And that was a very fun project because that led into, I was young and brash in those days. Now I'm just old and brash, but in those days I was young and brash. And when I was in New Mexico, the New Mexico Quality of Water Office, which did all the sediment work in that region, had just had a report bounced by Luna Leopold, which reported on a tremendous amount of data in the Rio Grande, from Cochiti on the north on down to San Miguel in the south, a stretch of a couple of 100 miles of the Rio Grande, and they collected data up and down there for the Bureau of Reclamation. And when they told me that they were having trouble writing this report, I thought real quickly, hey, if I get involved in that, I'm going to be in Albuquerque a lot. So I volunteered, and that led to a long period of cooperation with Jim Culbertson, who was a renowned sedimentologist in the Geological Survey. He was the head of the Albuquerque sediment lab at that time, sediment group. And in addition to that, got involved with sediment people from all over the U.S. because the USGS each year for a long time would call together anyone interested in sediment, and they would announce they were going to collect data. And if anyone wants to come collect data, we are going to do this, 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 and this. We're going to collect sediment. We're going to collect turbulence, temperature, bed forms. And if you want to do something, so people came in from all over. They came in from MIT and Caltech and CSU and Minnesota, Iowa, Georgia Tech. They would all congregate, and everybody knew that all these data were available and interchangeable. And all those data have been published now in professional papers.
And then there was quite a change, wasn't there, about the end of the 50s. 1960, you joined Herb Skibitsky in Tucson.
Yes.
A man that I nearly joined, but in fact found you at the door rather than Herb when I came out to the States.
Well, they often couldn't tell Herb Skibitsky from Dave Dawdy. The names are very similar, you know.
Yes.
Anyway, yes, what happened was those were the days when digital computers had very little power, and analog computers could solve lots of things. So therefore, certainly in passive analogs, the groundwater people were doing a lot of of analog modeling, and there was a question as to whether these techniques could be applied to surface water. And so they sent me down to Phoenix to work with Herb Skibitsky, and I learned to solder and put together models and solve the equations and everything. Learned a lot about circuit analysis. And in the process found that yes, analog models were very effective. They could do all sorts of good things, but of course digital computers developed so fast that they overtook the analogs and the analogs disappeared. But during that period of 60 to 65 along in there, a lot of people were doing analog models of surface water systems.
It was primarily, I think Herb was a groundwater man.
Herb definitely was a groundwater man, but he had this large analog lab. So they sent me there because then I would have all the support.
Right.
Plus Herb was a very good mathematician, so you could talk problems over with him, and he knew
I mean,
what...
He was what I would call a polymath.
Yes.
He knew a lot about everything and a great deal about some great depth into certain aspects. But you didn't stay all that long there, because in '63 when I came out to the States, you were already well established at Menlo Park.
Yes, before I agreed to go to Phoenix, I told them that they had to guarantee that I could stay at least 3 years. And after about, which they agreed to in writing. In about 6 months, they came and said, Dave, we want you to leave. And they wanted me to go off to Stanford and get a degree in statistics. Well, they didn't want me to go to Stanford. They wanted me to go off and get a degree in statistics, and I ended up at Stanford. But the argument was that they would rather take a hydrologist and teach them statistics than to take a statistician and try to teach them hydrology. And so I ended up going to Stanford. There's a long story there, but...
and that was a 12-month course at
It's
Stanford.
longer than that. I finished my master's degree and then was working on my doctorate when they reorganized the organization, and I was supposed to be transferred to Denver. So I dropped out of school. I was going on in operations research. I was going to get a doctorate in operations research under Harvey Wagner, who was really a good guy. And they told me to stand by in Menlo Park for further orders. And I stood by for 9 years. And that was the period when you came to see me. I was still standing by.
That's right.
They never did get that reorganization through, but I never did go back to school.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's like I was hitting myself over the head, and when I stopped, it felt so good I didn't want to start again.
Well, I know you were working on a number of projects when I joined you, but again, you were an enormous help to me in the project that I'd brought over from Imperial College, which was in the fairly early days of conceptual catchment modeling, 2 or 3 years after the Stanford model was first published. And I had brought this idea of automatic optimization in fitting models rather than hand optimization, where people were looking at graphs and curves and twiddling knobs and so on. And we had, I think, a useful collaboration. You certainly resolved some of the difficulties I was having with a computer program, an algorithm I brought with me, the famous Rosenbrock algorithm, and put a lot into the work that I did there, for which I'm forever grateful. But we produced a joint paper, which I think became something of a landmark in that particular aspect.
Not only a landmark, it is still being rewritten by graduate students today. And if they would read it, they wouldn't have to redo it. But then again, they wouldn't get a doctorate. So, yes, that was a very good collaboration. And I had been asked, prior to your showing up, to get the U.S. Geological Survey involved in rainfall runoff modeling. This was another bias of Benson's that had influenced the policy of the GS, is that he did not believe in unit hydrographs. That was a religious conviction of some sort. But for some reason, he didn't think the system was linear, and therefore unit hydrographs were wrong. And so therefore, under his influence, this had not gone forward. There were people in the GS who were very good unit hydrograph people and who developed theory and all, but it didn't get any support at the Washington level. And so when I was independent of Ben and was out in Menlo Park while he was in Washington, and he was still working on flood frequency, then they got me to start looking into this. So I was beginning to get my feet wet when you showed up, and threw me in the bathtub head first.
Well, yes,
And,
because we had the two aspects. There was the sort of catchment modelling,
yes.
and there was also the unit hydrograph project that I also brought with me
Yes.
that I'd been working on at Imperial, the harmonic analysis and other similar techniques.
And your Gibbs phenomenon.
And the Gibbs oscillations and the
Yes.
sigma factors and all that
Yes.
slew of things. It was a very productive time because you could bounce, or at least I could bounce from one of these things to the other. When you came to a grinding halt on some aspect, you'd go back and tackle the other one until you ground to halt on that one, and then by which time fresh thoughts had hit you, or we'd had more conversations. Or you spent your time teaching me to speak English, if you remember.
That's true. I never did quite succeed, but we got pretty far.
We got a bit far,
If you'd
yes.
stayed a little longer, you might have been able to speak. But the other thing is that the atmosphere in the Geological Survey, at least at that time for the researchers, was very open. You could do pretty much what you wanted. You were your own master. And that was what helped us, because we could work on what we thought were the problems and define what it was and tell our research managers, who then depended on us for their information about what was going on, which is the ideal way to manage research, I think.
There's one aspect of working with you, because I don't think we've discussed this before, but it was an open plan type office with screens. It was a vast room with screens, and you got lost in this maze trying to find where your office was. But I've often wondered about other people in the survey working in cells near us must have thought of the conversations going on in our particular cell, when we were both slamming the desk and saying, "Don't interrupt me while I'm interrupting you."
That's right. We were probably the noisier group in the building. Well, but for one thing, if I remember correctly, the Menlo Park sub-district was next to us, and they were all working hard and working up records with their eyes down on the desk and pencil in hand, oblivious to the world. So we couldn't bother them. They were lost in concentration. So
well, that was a very good time. I think you then kept on with this after I'd gone back to England and developed further aspects of this rainfall runoff modelling. And I see in 1969, tell me again what DR3M stands for.
Well, yes, after you left, and what we did together was a theoretical underpinning to understand how models operate. And then my charge was to come up with a model that operated and that solved certain problems. In particular, the GS wanted a way to extend records for flood frequency analysis. And so that was my first charge, and we developed a unit hydrograph model, essentially working from the ideas that you brought over, but where you and I used your simple model on our Dawdy O'Donnell paper. The later model kept the unit hydrograph and the Rosenbrock optimization, but put in an infiltration equation that was more realistic, and of this and that and the other, the bells and whistles, to come up with an actual predictive model. And then, as soon as that was on the shelf and was being used in the Geological Survey, then the demand for models was growing, and we wanted a distributed parameter model for predicting the effect of changes, man-made changes on the basin, which is the main purpose for a distributed parameter model. Because then if you have a distributed parameter model, it's physically based, and that was the whole idea that I always developed, that it should be physically based. Then you should be able to explain the changes that will take place in terms of parameters, put in those new parameters, and see what the effective change is. And that's what DR3M was, distributed routing rainfall runoff model. I didn't make up the name. That was the name of the paper. And the people who used it didn't want to read it. So.
Did you attempt with this, or did the team attempt a regionalization study of how parameters might be related, that is model parameters, related to catchment characteristics, whatever? A lot of that has been done, of course, but were you doing that at the time?
At the time, we were developing the model, and then it was implemented in many states and used for regional flood frequency. And the infiltration parameters in particular were regionalized by Bob Lichty, who was working under me. And in fact, you could take the parameters that were developed and plot them on a map, as usually was done, and you could see the similarities of the parameters in a region. And I used, later in consulting, after I left the Geological Survey, I used some of those results in consulting, went to the GS report, took the parameters from there and used them in my consulting without any optimization, using the parameters that were optimized for the various basins.
Was that, you mentioned the infiltration component, was that a Hortonian one or
No,
a Richards type thing?
It was a Phillips type, or green amped.
Yeah.
I called it a Phillips equation because I got it from Phillips' series of 17 papers.
Yeah.
But Jim Doog was the first to point out to me that that was really the green amped, and it predated Philip, and Philip just reported it.
Yes.
So I was properly chasing, but I still call it the Philip equation.
I think so, yes. I think Philip went a bit further than the green amped gang in his analysis. Right, so we move on. We're now up to, what do we get up into the 1969. After that, you moved to CSU, Colorado State University. And that again was a big shift in type of work and emphasis and so on. But you stayed, or joined rather, an existing GS group at,
we had
CSU.
a research. The GS has always had research groups at universities. We've had them at Georgia Tech, at Iowa, at CSU. We had about 8
people like
Simons. Well, Simons and Richardson had been there, but they were on the university staff then. But Jim Bennett was a recent graduate then, and Harvey Jobson was a recent graduate from CSU, was on the staff. Carl Nardine was there, and he got his PhD after he moved there. A guy named Harold Guy, who was one of the sediment experts, was there. And they were strongly into sediment. And that was part of the reason, I guess, why I went there, although I didn't do anything on sediment while I was there. The reason I went there, I finished this DR3M model, the distributed routing rainfall runoff model, put it on the shelf, and I said, you know, it's time for me to do something else. I should go off in a different direction. Once again, nobody in Washington knew what it should be. So I thought it would be good to get into the university game and try to do some research on something different. And so CSU was very strong in stochastic simulation. And I was very lucky that when I got there, there was a guy named Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe who was there, and some graduate students who were quite brilliant, a bunch of Latin Americans, Jose Mejia from Colombia, Jaime Millan from Colombia, Luis Garcia from Guatemala, Pepe Salas from Peru, who is now on the faculty, a senior member of the faculty there. All of those were there. In addition, that was the Latin mafia, as we call it. And then there was an Indian mafia, which included Vijay Singh, who is now at Louisiana State, and Vijay Gupta, who is here at Colorado. And these were a very active group. And so we did lots of good things working there. We call it the Underground Hydrology Group. We worked in those days there was a hot topic called the Hearst phenomenon. And that was Wallace and first Mandelbrot was the guy who brought it into hydrology, but Mandelbrot wasn't a hydrologist. Mandelbrot was a Hearst phenomenon, a self-similarity person who happened to run into Jim Wallace at IBM, both of them working at IBM. And Jim apparently told him about the Hearst phenomenon, and Mandelbrot said, well, that's nothing more than self-similarity, and they went off cooperating, and then Wallace got together with Metalis and did a bunch of simulations, as you know, about the Hearst phenomenon. And at CSU, we got it interested. Carl Nardine had been off for a year in Denmark, and he met a guy named Ditlevsen who did his doctorate while Carl was there, or maybe a little before. But at any rate, Carl brought back some books by Ditlevsen in this broken line process. And Ignacio immediately saw that this could be used to simulate the Hearst phenomenon, and it was more flexible than the models that Wallace Metalis were developing. In fact, it could preserve both the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies in the corellogram. So anyway, Mejia was a great mathematician, and Ignacio gave him the problem for his dissertation, and he developed the mathematics that turned Levson's work into hydrology. And Garcia was working on his dissertation and made some applications where there was long memory in the records because of karst hydrology. He used one from the United States, a large area in southern Missouri, and the problem in which he was working for his dissertation, which was the Chichoy in southern Mexico and Guatemala. And so a lot of good work came out of that. And the group still communicates and still exchanges war stories whenever we get together at meetings.
Indeed, I can interject. Even earlier today, you were meeting with this group here in Boulder this morning.
That's correct. Vijay Gupta is here, and I'm still working with Vijay Gupta some 25 years
That's
later,
right.
26 years
the dates
later.
again. That's so. Yep. Yep. So you stayed at CSU for 3 years, on doing the work that you've been talking of now, but then back to Menlo Park in 1972.
Yes.
And became assistant district chief for the California district.
Yes.
Now, what responsibilities did that entail?
Well, I was the technical assistant to the district chief, meaning, I think they call it I had a program officer under me. And so the program officer was in charge of all of the technical program in California, and he made sure that things got done, the paperwork and everything, kept track of who was supposed to be doing what. And I was the technical supervisor who went around and reviewed what they were doing and worked with them on getting better reports. Mm-hmm. And this included groundwater and quality of water and surface water. Mm-hmm. So it was
quite broad.
100 different projects or
yeah.
so,
Yeah.
with probably 50 to 100 professionals doing things, doing interesting things.
Well, this is when you started becoming eminence grise, I think, with all the
I guess so.
activities that you were covering there.
Yes.
And people dreaded your arrival, no doubt.
Well,
One
usually
hopes
what they did was they saved up the problems which they knew the answer was either difficult or impossible, and they'd try to trip you up on your answers.
Yes. Well, you had 4 years of doing this.
Well, actually only 2 years, because after I'd been in the district a couple of years, I was on a committee to reorganize the research program, and they wanted somehow to manage research. And so I was on a committee with Jake Rubin and John Breederhoff. That was the three of us were a committee. And what we did was we came up with a structure of research advisors, and we divided the research up into half a dozen areas. And we said, well, the research advisors should be rotated so they don't get a vested interest in things, so you get different viewpoints. But for their term of office, which will be 2 to 4 years or whatever it was, they will be responsible for the technical work in their field. So therefore, they would have the ability to go around to anyone and ask them what they were doing and review it and make a report on up the chain. But once again, it was researchers managing researchers. And once that structure was set up, I was picked as the first research advisor in surface water research. And I was that for 2 years up until I retired.
This is, yes, I came to this point now that you retired from the survey at the end of this particular spell. Can you say why, or is it not diplomatic for me to ask why, or I mean, did you just want challenging new fields yet again? Because you went from the survey to work with the consulting firm Dames and Moores.
Yes, that's correct. Well, let us say that I had some personality problems. I don't know if it's my personality or theirs, but I decided that I really wasn't being used properly. And I thought that I was being ineffective. And so I said, to hell with it, I quit. And didn't quit, I retired because I'd been in 25 years. So I retired, and the interesting thing was that I was in, by then the national headquarters had moved to Reston, and I was in the surface water office in Reston in April, say, of '76. And Don Thomas, who was the assistant chief of surface water, hung up the phone and said, "Don't want a job, do you?" "Oh, I don't know, what is it?" He said, "Well, there's Dames Moore over here, and they're looking for someone to head up their flood insurance program." Well, the interesting thing was, when I was the supervisor, the technical supervisor in the California district, the one thing I did not touch was the flood insurance program. I just told those people, "Now, look, you know what you're doing, you go do it, I'll leave you alone." It didn't seem to me that I could understand what the scientific problems were in there. It was all, it seemed very mechanical.
Actuarial,
Yeah.
as they say, yes.
And so here was this job doing precisely that. And, well, that was what started me thinking about leaving. So I checked with them, and they were quite interested. And in fact, they held a job open for me until I was eligible to retire 6 months later. And so when I retired, I got in the car and drove straight across the country and reported in and went to work. So it was a very short retirement.
Well, they brought a whole set of new types of problems, because there's always the time factor with any consulting job, that you want
Yes.
the answer yesterday. And not that the geological survey was a slow-moving thing, but there you had a program and you had planning ahead and so on.
The geological survey was very fast in geologic time, but
Not in real time.
not in real time.
Yeah.
Well, I told you that my little joke there, when I went to Dames and Moore, many people in the survey didn't know I had left, and I was in Bethesda, so I would go back to Reston looking for work for Dames and Moore. I would run into people in the hall. They'd ask why I was in. They took it for granted I was in on detail. And I'd tell, "Oh, I'm no longer with the survey. I'm over with Dames and Moore." "Oh, is that so? How do you find it out there in the real world?" I said, "It's really very much the same, except for one thing, you know. When I was in the geological survey and they asked me for a report, I always handed a memo explaining why I was going to be late. Dames and Moore, when they asked me for a report, I handed in."
The report, yeah.
So yes, there's a deadline in the real world.
You were working on a thing then called the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yes, and they have a flood insurance program which was set up as a result of work much influenced by Walter Langbein. Among the many things Walter Langbein did was he pushed for many years for a flood insurance program to try to mitigate floods rather than have a disaster every time a flood occurs. We haven't gotten there yet. We still had some disasters this last couple of years in the Mississippi Basin. But Walter's idea was that you have an insurance program for floods just like anything else.
Yeah.
And I went into this program as the chief hydrologist, where it turned out to be very interesting because all I got was the problems. I didn't get the routine work. All that routine that I would have had to review in the geological survey was reviewed by 200 technicians. We had, I don't know, half a dozen groups, as they call them, with group leaders. And these group leaders had 4 or 5 people under them, and they did all the technical review. And then there were a group of editors who reviewed things. There were a group of people who actually produced the maps. We actually produced the flood maps. Well, anyway, point was, I could sit there and wait for the problems to come to me, and they would always be interesting problems. And so, in fact, when I showed up, they had saved a few of these interesting problems. So the day I reported in, they dropped a stack of papers on my desk and said, "Here, these are things that need to be answered." And so,
Well, Dames and Moore still is an international setup. It's not solely a United States setup.
in
I say
fact,
that
I came through London once with Dames
exactly
and Moore,
because 2 or 3 of my graduate students from Imperial College went through Dames and Moores as well for short
yeah.
periods or longer periods. But that it introduced me to the firm long before I had a student join the firm. Yeah.
Yes, it was quite a good firm, and it was international. And I ended up doing some work in Latin America while I was with Dames and Moore, and went to London on a project that never did come to fruition, but I worked on the proposal. And where else? That may be the only places overseas that I worked with Dames and Moore. But they had offices all over, and they their headquarters in Los Angeles, but a very active group there in Washington, D.C., at Bethesda. And as I say, our one project was well, it varied from 100 to 200 people, depending on the amount of work. But it was a large project, and we were one of 4 what they call technical evaluation contractors. And the country was divided up into parts, and I was lucky enough to go with Dames Moore, which handled the western United States. And so therefore I was handling a region that I was familiar with. And many times the problems they brought in, I could say, yes, I know that stream, I have been there, stuff like that. And in fact, in one of their reports, they had a picture of me making a discharge measurement. It was picked out of the newspapers.
This is the business of going right back to roots
going back
again.
to 1952, the flood of 1952. And there I was out on a cableway making a discharge measurement. And so they blew that up and framed it for me.
But throughout all this period, you didn't drop out of the conference scene, the assembly scene, because we kept on meeting at IS, International Association of Scientific Hydrology meetings, in all over the world.
Well, what happened there was that there was a group of which you were an integral member, and Jim Doog was one of the leaders, and he and Kalinin and Eamon Nash and you and Peter Wolf and
Jim Emerocho.
Jim Emerocho was the big pusher and shaker for the United States, and he shook things. But you got together, and Jim Doog arranged for this committee on mathematical models to be set up, an independent committee, independent of the commissions, in IHS. And his idea was that, as you well know, that we should have meetings at that time east of the Iron Curtain, because that's the only way you get the Eastern Bloc with the Western Bloc. If you held in the West, none of the Easters could come. But if we held it in the East, all the Westerners could get there. And so we had meetings. And first one was in Warsaw, I think.
Yeah.
We had 2 meetings in Warsaw. And we had one in Bratislava. We also had one in, where else? Budapest.
Yes, that was later, yes.
That was where we had the wonderful meeting on the island in the Danube where Kalinin and Kaczmarek and Jim Doog and I and Shestai went out and lived it up for a week planning this meeting.
Yes.
And I have a picture of myself. Kalinin challenged me to a drinking bout. Now, first and foremost, I didn't accept the challenge, because I know that any Russian can outdrink any American, particularly when it's vodka. So anyway, everybody egged me on, and I was convinced that I was stone cold sober the whole time. But the next day they had taken some pictures. I was sitting there like, quite obviously, Kalinin was still perfectly sober, but I wasn't.
It's I quite agree with you. I know this isn't really hydrology, but the Eastern Bloc countries in those days loved having parties of Westerners coming, because then they were allowed to throw up a big party. Wherever you went, there was always a big party.
Yes.
I didn't learn this trick for quite some time, but being shown around a hydraulics laboratory or whatever the institution was, you would stop to ask a question, and your Russian or whichever country it was host would hurry you on, and you thought, oh, he's trying to keep quiet. He doesn't really want to tell us what the answer to that one is. The answer was he wanted to get you to the reception at the end of the tour and start drinking.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing there was that wherever I went, they always had these tours of laboratories, as you say. And, you know, I always told them, honestly, once you've seen water run down a flume, it's the same all over the world. And they would say, oh, well, they being hosts would say, well, what do you want to do? So I would say, well, what have you got historical or archaeological? So I got some wonderful tours, private tours, and they would go to the National Museum and find an eminent archaeologist to take me on a tour of a site he was digging or something. So I had very few of those tours, but we always made it back in time for the reception.
The reception, yes. Very important, very important.
Yeah.
So that went on for quite a few years, as Dames and Moore, but you eventually retired from them.
To get back to the Committee on Mathematical Models, in which you were a very important part, and I think that was a tremendous impetus for cooperation
it was.
in the hydrologic community. Eamon Nash and you and Jim leading the European contingent, and a lot of people who are here today were part of that committee and went to those meetings.
Yep.
And we drew in a large group of people that got to know each other.
Yes.
That wouldn't have otherwise.
This committee eventually became a commission of the International Association, a commission on water resource systems,
Yes.
which is now, or even then, when it was first formed, moved away from the what you might call the blackboard hydrology, the business of arguing with the
Yes.
blackboard and rubbing out your colleagues' writing while you wrote your own writing on, and he would rub yours out. And there's a lot of sparking off each other.
Yes.
That died out once it became a rather formalized commission
That's
with
correct.
bureaus and minutes and all the rest.
The commissions are quite structured, whereas we were as unstructured as we could be.
Yeah.
We had one committee meeting. I remember Jim Doug was the chairman. At that time, Nathan Burris was the vice chairman, and I was the secretary. And we were driving between Madrid and Sevilla, and we stopped in a nice square there and got a bottle of champagne from, well, a cava, whatever they call it in Spain, out on the table, and we had an official committee meeting. And Jim insisted we put down whatever town that was. Committee meeting at such and such a place, on such and such a day.
It's formally in the minutes somewhere.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And that was sort of the way it was, that you got together, the group, and you talked.
Yes, in a number of interesting places, not only dull places like Imperial College London, but interesting places like Breukelen in Holland.
Yes.
Always stimulating, somewhat exhausting. One was glad to get back home and get some sleep. But nevertheless, a lot of useful ideas came out. Sometimes a lot of nonsense was talked, but then that was the way of life, if you
That's
weren't
correct.
quite sure where you were going. So we move on. Eventually you retired from Dames and Moore and went in for private
didn't
consulting.
exactly retire.
They threw you out?
After 4 years, well, while I was at Dames and Moore, I did some things that were very interesting. Two of the things that were of scientific interest and of some import was I worked on the method for delineation of flood hazards on alluvial fans. And when I first arrived at Dames and Moore, this alluvial fans are a phenomenon or a feature that's all over the western United States and in the arid regions. And they had no means for analyzing the flood hazard. They could do the hydrology and get a 100-year flood, let's say. But the two procedures that were used for mapping the flood hazard was either to say, well, it's uniform depth across this fan, and we just compute until it gets half a foot deep, which was their criterion for flood hazards. And that meant that 100 yards down from the apex, it ceased having a hazard, whereas, of course, the damages were always further on down. And the other method was to look at the alluvial fan and see where the water had gone last and do a HEC2 routing up this residual channel. And if the channel went anywhere else, you completely missed the flood hazard. And so FEMA rejected all these studies. And so there were no flood maps on alluvial fans when I showed up. And it was very interesting because once again, those things you learned in the past came back because when I was listening to one of their meetings, the way FEMA solves problems is they call together 100 people and discuss it. And this obviously is going to come to a conclusion. So I sat in the back of the room leaning up against the wall, and a couple of people made remarks. One, that on alluvial fans things run at critical depth because the steepness it would be critical, and if it gets supercritical it just makes the channel bigger. And therefore it adjusts itself. It automatically adjusts itself to flow at critical depth. That was one guy's theory. Another guy stood up from, both of these were from the Corps of Engineers, and said that in fact that there was a certain relationship of width to depth that these things adjusted to. And I said, well, you know, you've only got 3 factors, width, depth, and velocity. That's only 2 degrees of freedom because all 3 multiplied together, thinking in terms of Leopold and Langbein on channel geometry. Their famous papers on channel geometry, hydraulic characteristics, channel geometry, whatever it was. I said, with those two constraints, you should have a solution. And we should, in fact, come out with some sort of relationship that looks like the Leopold solution for open channel flow. And so I went back and worked on this. And in fact, I came up with a solution, which I then put a guy to work solving by hand until I figured out a trick to get a closed form solution, which turned out, when we got it, that in fact we checked his hand solution. We had already had a case where he was doing this work. So that turned out to be very good. And in fact, the coefficients that came out were very close to the Leopold and the Langbein coefficients for standard channels. And that method now has been implemented throughout the United States, or throughout the West anyway, for the mapping of flood hazards on alluvial fans. In fact, there's a National Academy of Sciences committee right now. The National Research Council has a committee on alluvial fans. It's looking into some of the questions that have been raised on how do we determine when there is a flood hazard on an alluvial fan. But the mechanics of delineating that flood hazard are implemented. The other thing I got involved in was flooding from hurricanes, coastal flooding. Once again, the FEMA had a problem with this, and they had asked the NRC to set up a committee, and that committee had come up with a procedure, and I took a group of my technicians, and we came up with a cookbook procedure for implementing what the National Academy Committee had recommended. And it got approved, and we mapped the coast of Alabama, and we got sued, as FEMA always does, and we won in the Alabama courts. No, we won in the federal courts because the Attorney General of Alabama was the one who was suing us.
Well, that led, I know, later in your experience, to a great deal of litigation work, sometimes on both sides of the argument, if I remember rightly.
Correct, yes.
So tell us a bit more about that side.
Well, after I left Dames and Moore, I was offered a job heading up a group on a pipeline job, where I would head up a group doing something. And that was the Trans-Alaskan gas pipeline. And so I had a group of about 20 people, and the three best ones in the group came from Dames and Moore. I stole them from Dames and Moore and took them with me. And we were set up first in Southern California, then in Houston, Texas, planning for this pipeline that never came to fruition. But we were doing all of the hydraulics and hydrology for determining the river crossings by this pipeline. Well, I was there only about 2 years when this thing folded, and I went in on my own, and I've been doing consulting since '82, which is what, 13 years now
ago.
I've been on my own in San Francisco. I was setting up an office for the company in the Bay Area, and when the project folded, they left me stranded in San Francisco. I can't think of a worse fate than to be stranded in San Francisco. But anyway, I had already developed a job. As I had no termination pay, but they left me all the receivables and all work which I had developed. That was my termination pay. And so one of the jobs was, as you say, litigation. It was a channel migration problem, and I was on this. In fact, Herb Skibitsky got the job for me. Herb was an expert on groundwater on this case, and I was an expert on channel migration. And it was very interesting. It was working for a water company that was being sued because they were pumping groundwater, and this was supposedly what was causing the bank instability. But anyway, we won that case, but it was something like 6 months full-time labor that got me into the litigation game, and B, into private consulting on my own. And I've worked for other people on flood problems and on channel migration through the years, just the normal litigation. When every time a flood hits, people start suing each other. And in fact, in one case I was on, a company got sued because they had a pipe going across this creek, which the other side claimed caused backwater. It turned out they didn't own the pipe. It wasn't theirs, but it was simpler to pay $25,000 to get out of the case than to go into court and prove it wasn't their pipe. I mean, there's things like that that go on. But anyway, those are pretty mundane problems.
Well, they're certainly quite different from a lot of the other things we've been talking about.
Oh, yes, they're sometimes interesting, but they never really accomplish anything. You know, either one side wins or the other side wins. Sometimes it's based on the facts and sometimes it's not. But generally speaking, I've come out on the winning side, except in the latest thing that I've gotten into, which is really very interesting, and that's water rights cases. And there I am an expert in sediment transport again. I've gone full circle, and I have jumped in with both feet in support of the Parker method for estimating or predicting the movement of gravels in gravel bed streams. Instead of sand bed streams, it's gravel bed streams. And the Parker method is a very good engineering tool that is borne out by the more fundamental work of Jim Smith of USGS, who was at the University of Washington, is now here at at USGS here in Boulder, affiliated with the University of Colorado. And Jim Smith looks at the particles and how they move and the pocket angles and all that sort of stuff and derives everything, and then shows that in fact what you get is very close to what Parker predicts, strictly from similitude and getting a good engineering answer. Well, anyway, I've been applying the Parker method to the movement of gravel bed streams because and working for the Forest Service in general, because the Forest Service says we want to maintain the channels, so we will let you take water as long as we can maintain the channels. And their measure of maintaining the channels, or at least one of them, is that the sediment gets moved. And so they're setting up what they call a claim structure, and this claim structure is based partly on how much the sediment moves before and after, based on natural hydrology and their claim structure. So that's been very interesting. And I am involved in several cases on water rights that involve this sort of problem. So I've gone, I guess like you have, circle and circle around the same things over and over. Flood frequency keeps coming back and I get involved in flood frequency, and sediment keeps coming back and I get involved in sediment transport, and then back into flood frequency and back into sediment transport. And the flood frequency, of course, while I'm doing all this in sediment transport with one part of myself, the other part is now involved with Vijay Gupta on his scaling problems and on regional flood frequency, which I think is a very interesting scientific problem. It's very interesting also that way back when somebody in graduate school back at Fort Collins asked me whether they should get into the flood frequency problem. And I told him, because Benson had just come up with this Log Pearson 3 paper and the GS had regional methods developed by Benson, I said, that's nothing in that to be studied. Stay away from flood frequency. There's nothing there. Well, now, all these years later, that's what I'm deeply into, because I think we're trying to find the information that's in all those USGS reports. The USGS has done very good jobs of delineating how to predict region by region the floods at a particular ungauged site. But in all those relationships, there's lots of information that's not being utilized. And Vijay Gupta is trying to get a theoretical foundation for that in this scaling theory. And scaling theory is the hot topic today. And so I'm happy to be involved in that. I don't understand what Vijay is talking about usually.
But it's nice to be involved.
Yes, nice to be involved.
Well, I think you've certainly kept closer to these interesting developments around the hydrologic world than I have. I've rather taken life quietly since retiring, keeping in touch through editing the journal. Perhaps I should have been more active. It's great fun listening to all this. I'm not involved anymore. I think the time will come when also you will say, well, that's it now. I'm going to go on collecting my coins and looking at my stamp albums and maybe listening to music. Will that happen? Will that happen?
I doubt it. I doubt it.
Yeah.
I think that there are just too many interesting problems out there.
So
And
it's like the proverbial balloon. You push it in one place and something
right.
comes out on the other side.
Plus the fact I like to argue.
Yes.
And
I think that will have come out in this interview.
yes, I therefore like to get into these topics that are, you know,
Controversial.
controversial right at the front. And that was true certainly with the broken line process and the Hearst phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Well, incidentally, that comes full around because scaling is nothing more than an explanation of the Hearst phenomenon.
Okay.
The Hearst phenomenon was a particular case of scaling.
Yeah.
And I tried to put that into one of our papers, but with Vijay Gupta, which we've written several. And Vijay says, no, we don't want to get the Hearst back in here. Keep that out of this. You say Hearst phenomenon and people start arguing about it. Let's get on to scaling. So he puts it in a broader context. But in fact, it seems to me that many of the things that we're doing in scaling in space, which is what Vijay is doing, that particularly on the flood frequency, it's a slice in time. It's not over time, but it's a characteristic that's a particular point. So therefore, it's spatial scaling. The Hearst is scaling in time, and there has to be a tie-in.
Yeah.
And eventually, I'm sure Vijay is going to get to that.
Yeah.
He has to, because when he gives his presentation, the scaling of the rainfall, which is spatial and in time, has an impact on the basin and develops the channel system, which has a scaling characteristic. And those two together generate the scaling for the runoff. The runoff scaling for flood peaks is only one aspect of it. There's the whole hydrograph. And so eventually we're going to have to get back to tying together scaling in time and scaling in space and have a general theory of scaling. I hope.
That's the problem for the future.
Yeah.
Is this the line, or is it one of several lines that you think you would recommend to young hydrologists, people coming through graduate school now?
Well, what would I recommend? One, if they're in hydraulics, I would say sediment transport. I think that the problem of sand channel streams is fairly well understood. It may not be taught, but if you go back and read the literature, you can get together a coherent picture of how sand channel streams operate. Now, we don't know, or have not explained as yet, how the shift from dunes to upper regime occur. There have been lots of papers written on that, but there's no fundamental work on that, how they wash out the dunes and what it is that triggers that. Although in some places you can see it happen strictly from temperature. So we know that changing the viscosity of the water can switch you from dunes to upper regime flows. The same discharge will have much different resistance characteristics, much different depths and velocities. And you can actually see it in the hydrograph. So that's one thing. But I think the real interesting thing is the stuff that Jim Smith is doing. J. Dungan Smith in the GS, not the Jim Smith from Princeton, who is working on this fundamentals of sediment transport for gravel bed streams. And the question that I come up with, is there actually a characteristic shear that is universal for all streams, or is it related to something? And how do we measure it? Because how do we measure shear in these steep mountain streams where what we're wanting is the local shear at this cross section, but what is the local shear there and how do we measure it? And if we use a reach slope to get our shear, over what reach are we talking about? So there are some conceptual problems of how we measure shear in steep mountain streams. And this is sort of a very applied problem, but it gets back to the theoretical problem of what makes sediment move. So I think there's some problems. The other one is, and I have suggested this to the Corps at Vicksburg, that they should pay me to do this, but they never have agreed. They said they're going to do it, but I haven't seen them do it yet. And that's, how do we measure the bed material? In other words, the Parker method can depend either on the surface material or the sub-pavement, as he calls it. And they have different relationships for sediment transport according to his paper, of which he based on Oak Creek in Oregon, on Milhouse's dissertation. But the interesting thing there is that we have a technique for getting the sediment distribution of the bed from the Woolman pebble count for resistance to flow. But that's not the same thing as the bed material which you would use for sediment transport, because generally speaking, you don't get the small material sampled. And so should we take a layer off the top to get the surface material, or what? And there are those who say that there are ways to do it by laying a grid down and such, but once again, you're back to the point of how do you make sure you're not picking the larger material only.
Yeah.
So that's a conceptual problem. How do we typify the bed material? And then how do we translate that into the sediment transport? Those are two very interesting areas for me in terms of sand transport and gravel transport.
Yeah. This really is physical hydrology
Yes.
in its true sense, well away from the blackboard hydrology that
That's right.
we first got involved in.
Yeah.
Do you see any
in the blackboard
future
hydrology,
in that one?
Oh, yes, very much. That's the stuff that Vijay Gupta is doing, the scaling problem in general. And what Jim Dew pushes, and in fact, I've ran into a paper here of a Japanese colleague from University of Tokyo. And it was a good example to me of what Jim Dew was saying, because it was a nonlinear analysis of the flow hydrograph. And I said, well, you know, it looks to me like what you've really got is a more than one linear system operating here. And what you should do first is define the multiple linear systems. Do that first, and then take the deviations from that to study your nonlinearity.
Right.
Don't try the nonlinearity on the whole system.
Yeah.
So I think that this, the theory of linearization, how we linearize, and the conceptual problems, which really is blackboard hydrology, because if you do it a linear system, you can actually do some closed form solutions.
Right. Yes,
Whereas with the nonlinear stuff, you got to go to that
Yeah.
computer. And as you said, and I quote you, don't you think they should be forced to do without that computer for their first several
6
years?
months.
Yes.
Yes, it would be a good thing.
But that's one
Yeah.
problem. The scaling approach, it's like Jim Duke asked one of our colleagues on a picnic last Sunday, when the guy said something about physically based models. He said, what do you mean by a physically based model? The answer that person gave, I didn't agree with. So I then gave my explanation of what a physically based model is. And I think that the whole concept of simplicity in modeling, the concept of a physically based model and how much physics should be put into a physically based model is a very important consideration. This sort of comes into the scale problem too, and the way people think about scale problems in hydrology often is, if we have a 1 square mile basin and a 10 square mile basin and a 100 square mile basin and a 1,000 square mile basin, we might have different parameters or different ways of estimating parameters for those. That's sort of scale problems in hydrology, although really it's an implementation rather than a theory. But yes, I think that this as a subset of scaling problems is still of great interest. How can we average responses? Well, infiltration equations. When we do an infiltration equation as a physically based model, as we did in the USGS models, and we apply it to a sub-basin, what does it mean? What do the parameters mean?
Indeed.
And what it does is it gives us a structure which is the right shape for a response, but the parameters may have little relation to the true
Yeah,
numbers
true.
when you go out and do it.
What you actually measure. Yeah.
So that's a good problem.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are working on this, what is it that we can do to describe the measurements at points and relate them to the parameters in a model at a different scale. That's an interesting problem. But the other one also that I think was being done on this global circulation modeling, the PILF study that was reported on last week, is how can we take these complex models and come up with a set of critical parameters that we can then study the sensitivity analysis of, much as we were doing in our simplified model back in the 60s, and come up with what's really important in these models. And what are the things that aren't sensitive, therefore they don't count. You don't have to go around doing all these complicated models if they don't affect the answer. Well, I think that's still simplicity in modeling and parsimony of parameters is a good area. Well, you know, Eamon Nash always liked to come in and point out that anybody's model could be just as well approximated with one parameter instead of 15. And often he was right, because the more parameters you had, the more you screwed things up rather than helping out. And so I think that that concept in a theoretical framework, not just as a tool, but in a theoretical framework, is an important area for research. And to keep going back to Vijay Gupta's work on scaling invariance, as he calls it, he's working on rainfall, on channel networks, and on the runoff characteristics, basin response. And he's trying to relate them all together. And he's doing it on flood flows to start with. And my argument is that should apply to daily mean flows, to monthly flows, to annual flows, to low flows, and yet the scaling characteristics should be different. And then how do they differ when you go from one to another of those parameters?
Well, you've outlined there are plenty of problems to be solved. The more you solve, the more will pop up all over the place.
Right. That's the beauty of hydrology.
We will never arrive at nirvana, or there must be a hydrological heaven somewhere. Do you think we will get in through the pearly gates? Have we done our bit to earn our way in?
Through hydrology, or perhaps through hydrology we'll get into the hydrologic pearly gates.
Yes, in a sort of limbo for a little while, a sort of purgatory, no doubt, to expiate our other sins.
Who was the dog that was guarding the gates of
Cerberus.
hell?
Cerberus.
Yes, Cerberus. Well, he will undoubtedly let us into the hydrologic heaven, because after all, he's a water god.
Yes.
In fact, he was a water god, wasn't he?
I don't know that. I just know him as being the guardian.
Yes.
Across the river Styx, was it?
Yes.
He stands on the other side.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Dave, for a very interesting and I hope illuminating discussion that those young hydrologists who may at some time see this tape and other tapes which are being made in the series will learn, if not from our achievements, from our mistakes. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.